I need you to hear me right now. Too many of us are spending all our time, all our energy, all our focus on the wrong thing. We're looking at the problem, we're stressing over the situation, we're worrying about the storm, but hear me, that's not where your focus should be. See, when you focus on the problem gets bigger. When you focus on the struggle gets stronger. But when you focus on God, when you put your faith in Him, when you trust that He's already worked it out, that's when things start to shift. So today, I'm not here to talk about problems, I'm here to talk about power. I'm here to tell you that your breakthrough isn't in complaining. It's in commitment. Your victory isn't in worrying, it's in worship, and your future. It's not in fear, it's in faith. So let's get real. Let's get focused, and let's lock in on what really matters. It's time to stop magnifying the problem and start magnifying God. You ready? When you wake up in the morning, what's the first thing on your mind? Is it your struggles, your worries, your frustrations, or is it God? Too many people spend their days consumed by their problems, thinking about everything that's going wrong, everything that's against them, and everything they don't have. And the problem with that mindset is that whatever you focus on, you give power to, you give energy to, you feed it, and what you feed grows. If you keep focusing on the problem, all you're doing is giving it more control over your life. You're making it bigger than it actually is. You're letting it dictate your emotions, your decisions, and your future. It's like staring at a storm and convincing yourself it will never end. The more you focus on it, the more hopeless you feel. You start believing that the struggle is permanent, that the pain will never stop, that the situation is bigger than you can handle. And once you let that mindset take over, it paralyzes you. It keeps you stuck in the same cycle of doubt, fear, and anxiety. But let me tell you something, God never called you to focus on the problem. He called you to focus on Him. He called you to trust that He is bigger than whatever you're facing. He called you to believe that no matter how bad it looks, He's still in control. And when you shift your focus from your problem to God, everything changes. Think about Peter when he stepped out of the boat to walk on water. As long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he was doing the impossible. He was walking on top of the storm. But the moment he started focusing on the wind, the waves, the danger, he began to sink. Why? Because his focus shifted from the one who gave him strength to the thing that threatened him. And that's exactly what happens in our lives. When we focus on God, we move forward, we have peace, we have confidence. But when we focus on the storm, we start drowning in fear, in doubt, in worrying. Some of you have been stuck in the same place for years, not because God isn't working, but because you keep magnifying the problem instead of magnifying Him. You keep looking at what's wrong instead of looking at who's right there with you. And the truth is, the more you focus on the problem, the less room you leave for God to move. You try to control things that were never meant to be in your hands. You try to fix things in your own strength instead of trusting in His power. But when you choose to focus on God, when you make a decision to turn your eyes away from the distractions, away from the negativity, away from the fear, you open yourself up to His peace. You start to see things differently. The problem may not disappear immediately, but your perspective changes. Instead of seeing how big the mountain is, you remember how big your God is. Instead of stressing about how things will work out, you trust that He already has a plan. Instead of feeling defeated, you feel empowered because you know you're not fighting alone. Your focus determines your direction. If you keep looking at what's wrong, you'll stay stuck in the same cycle. But if you focus on God, if you put your energy into seeking Him, worshiping Him, and believing in His promises, you'll move forward. You'll walk in faith instead of fear. You'll find strength even in the struggle, and most importantly, you'll experience the kind of peace that doesn't come from circumstances. It comes from knowing that no matter what happens, God's got you. Fear is one of the most powerful forces that can take over a person's life. It starts small, just a thought, just a worry, just a question in the back of your mind. But if you let it grow, if you give it space, if you allow it to sit in your heart, it begins to take control. It begins to shape the way you see the world, the way you make decisions, the way you handle challenges. Fear has a way of making everything look worse than it really is. It magnifies the problem. It makes obstacles look impossible to overcome. It takes a situation that could be temporary and convinces you that it will last forever. Fear is powerful, but it only has as much power as you give it. The problem is that too many people allow fear to dictate their lives. They allow fear to make their decisions. They allow fear to control their emotions, and the more they focus on what they're afraid of, the bigger the fear grows. Fear is like a shadow. It looks bigger than it really is, but it has no substance, no real power, unless you give it power. The more you focus on your problems, the more you allow fear to consume your thoughts, the more control you give it over your life. But faith works the same way. Faith also has the power to shape your perspective, to guide your decisions, to give you strength in the middle of your struggles. The difference is that fear magnifies your problems, but faith magnifies God's power. Fear tells you it's impossible. Faith tells you that with God, all things are possible. Fear says you're alone in this. Faith says that God will never leave you or forsake you. Fear makes you focus on the worst-case scenario. Faith makes you focus on God's promises. You can't walk in both fear and faith at the same time. You have to choose which one you will magnify. You have to decide whether you will let fear control your life or if you will stand in faith and trust that God is bigger than anything you're facing. When you focus on fear, you live in a constant state of stress, worrying, and doubt. You spend all your time thinking about what could go wrong, and in doing so, you stop yourself from moving forward. But when you focus on faith, you start seeing the possibilities instead of the problems. You start believing that even in the worst situations, God is still in control. It's easy to let fear take over when things aren't going the way you planned, when the bills are piling up, when the diagnosis ain't what you wanted to hear, when the relationship is falling apart. Fear will try to convince you that there's no way out. Fear will tell you that you'll never make it, that things will never change, that you might as well give up. But in those moments, you have to remind yourself of who God is. You have to remind yourself of what He's already brought you through. Because the same God who carried you before, the same God who will carry you now. Fear wants to keep you stuck, but faith will push you forward. Fear will have you running from your purpose, but faith will have you walking boldly into your destiny. The choice is yours. What you magnify will determine the life you live. If you focus on fear, your problems will always seem too big to handle. But if you focus on faith, you'll realize that nothing is too big for God. The more you magnify Him, the smaller your problems become in comparison to His power. Worrying is a thief. It steals your peace, your joy, your energy. It keeps you up at night, playing out worst-case scenarios in your mind. It makes you feel like you have control over something just because you're thinking about it. But in reality, worrying changes absolutely nothing. You can spend hours, days, even years worrying about a situation, and not 1 second of that will make things better. Worrying doesn't fix the problem, it only drains you while the problem remains the same. The problem is that too many people live in a state of constant worrying. They wake up worried. They go to sleep worried. They pray. But even after they say Amen, they pick the worrying back up as if it's their responsibility to carry. Worrying becomes a habit, something they don't even realize they're doing. But here's the truth: worrying is just fear disguised as responsibility. It's fear pretending to be productive. It's fear convincing you that if you just think about the problem long enough, you'll somehow figure it out. But the reality is, worrying does nothing but make the problem seem bigger than it is. Worrying makes you feel overwhelmed. It makes you feel like you're drowning in your situation, like there's no way out. And the more you focus on it, the heavier it gets. But worship is the opposite. Worship takes your focus off the problem and puts it back on God. Worship reminds you that, no matter what you're facing, God is still in control. It reminds you that your problems are temporary, but God's power is eternal. When you worship, something shifts. The problem may still be there, but your perspective changes. You're no longer looking at it from a place of fear, but from a place of faith. You start to realize that the situation that seemed impossible is nothing for the God who created the universe. You stop seeing yourself as defeated and start seeing yourself as victorious. Worship doesn't just change your atmosphere, it changes you. It takes you out of survival mode and puts you into surrender mode. It reminds you that you don't have to figure everything out because God already has a plan. Look at Paul and Silas. When they were in prison, they had every reason to worry. They had every reason to be afraid. But instead of sitting there, dwelling on their problems, they started worshiping. They started praising God right there in the middle of their situation. And what happened? The prison doors swung open. The chains fell off. Their worship didn't just set them free, it set everyone around them free. That's the power of worship. It shifts the atmosphere. It breaks chains. It invites God into the situation and makes room for Him to move. Some people think they have to wait until things get better to worship. They think they have to wait until the problem is solved, until the breakthrough comes, until the pain is gone. But worship is not a reaction to things getting better. Worship is the reason things get better. Worship is an act of faith. It's saying, God, I trust you even before I see the solution. I believe in your power even while I'm still in the struggle. It's choosing to praise before the victory comes because you know that the victory is already guaranteed. When you worry, you're letting your problems be bigger than your God. But when you worship, you're reminding yourself that God is bigger than your problems. Worrying leaves you exhausted, anxious, and stuck. Worship fills you with peace, strength, and confidence. The problem might not disappear instantly, but the weight of it will. Worship shifts your focus, and when your focus is on God, you realize that nothing is too hard for Him. So many people live their lives weighed down by stress, anxiety, and fear because they are trying to control things that were never meant to be in their hands. They spend hours overthinking, planning, and worrying, trying to figure out every detail, trying to make sure everything goes exactly the way they want. But no matter how much they stress, no matter how much they try to fix things in their own strength, it never seems to be enough. That's because breakthrough doesn't come from stressing, it comes from trusting. It comes from letting go of control and putting everything in God's hands. When you try to handle everything on your own, you carry a burden you are never meant to carry. You hold onto problems that are too heavy for you, and that weight starts affecting every part of your life. It drains your energy. It steals your joy. It keeps you up at night. You start feeling overwhelmed, discouraged, and stuck. But the moment you decide to trust God, The moment you shift from trying to fix everything yourself to fully surrendering to Him, everything begins to change. Trusting God doesn't mean you ignore your problems. It doesn't mean you pretend everything is perfect. It means you acknowledge the problem, but you choose to put your faith in God rather than in your own ability to solve it. It means you stop relying on your own strength and start leaning on His. It means you believe that even when you can't see the way, God already has a plan. It means you refuse to let fear control your actions because you know that the one who created you has already gone ahead of you. Look at the story of the Israelites when they were trapped between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army. They were facing an impossible situation. From a human perspective, there was no way out. They had the choices. They could panic, or they could trust God. And when Moses told them to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, that's exactly what happened. God made a way where there was no way. He split the sea. He didn't need them to stress. He just needed them to trust. The same is true for your life. When you're in a difficult situation, when everything looks impossible, when you feel like you have no way out, you have two choices. You can stress, worry, and try to figure everything out on your own, or you can surrender and trust that God is already working things out for your good. You can live in fear, or you can live in faith, but you can't do both at the same time. Trusting God is not always easy. It requires you to let go of control. It requires you to believe even when you don't have all the answers. It requires you to walk in faith even when you don't see immediate results. But when you choose trust over stress, you begin to experience peace that doesn't make sense. You begin to see doors open that you could never have opened on your own. You begin to feel a strength that is not your own carrying you through situations that should have broken you. Too many people miss their breakthrough because they are too busy trying to control things that only God can control. They hold on to stress instead of holding onto His promises. But the moment you stop trying to do it all in your own power and fully surrender to Him, you make room for miracles. You make room for Him to step in and do what only He can do. You begin to realize that you are never meant to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. He already carried it for you. Too often, people spend their time talking about how big their problems are. They go from person to person, conversation to conversation, repeating the same story about how bad things are, how much they're struggling, how nothing seems to be working out for them. They dwell on the pain, the frustration, the obstacles. The more they talk about their problems, the bigger those problems seem. The more they focus on what's wrong, the more overwhelming it feels. But the truth is, the size of your problem is not the issue, the size of your focus is. Instead of talking about how big the problem is, you need to start talking about how big your God is. When you focus on your problems, they consume you. They become all you can see. Every thought is wrapped around what's going wrong. Every word that comes out of your mouth reinforces your struggles. And as you keep magnifying the problem, it starts to look impossible to overcome. But that's only because your perspective is off. The problem is not bigger than your God. Your focus just isn't on Him. Think about David when he faced Goliath. The entire army of Israel was terrified. They stood there, paralyzed by fear, because all they could see was how big Goliath was. They kept talking about his size, his strength, his weapons. They kept repeating how impossible it was to defeat him. But David had a different focus. He wasn't worried about how big Goliath was. He was focused on how big his God was. He knew that if God was with him, the size of the enemy didn't matter. That's the mindset that led him to victory. What you speak about, what you meditate on, What you magnify determines how you approach life. If you keep speaking about your struggles, they will control you. If you keep focusing on your fears, they will hold you back. But if you shift your focus to God, if you start speaking His promises, if you start magnifying His power instead of your problems, everything changes. You begin to see solutions instead of obstacles. You begin to feel peace instead of anxiety. You begin to walk in faith instead of fear. Some people spend so much time complaining that they don't realize they're keeping themselves stuck. Every time they speak about their problems more than they speak about God, they reinforce their struggles. They give power to their circumstances instead of giving power to their faith. But the moment you decide to change your language, to change your focus, to shift from problem-centered thinking to God-centered thinking, you step into a new level of strength. Look at the Israelites when they were on the edge of the promised land. 12 spies went to check out the land. 10 of them came back talking about how big the giants were. They spread fear, doubt, and negativity, and as a result, an entire generation missed out on what God had for them. But Joshua and Caleb came back with a different report. They didn't deny that the giants were there, but they focused on the fact that God was bigger. They believed that if God had promised them victory, nothing could stop them. Their focus was the key difference between fear and faith, between defeat and victory. If you want to see change in your life, you have to start speaking differently. Instead of saying, "This problem is too big," start saying, "My God is bigger." Instead of saying, "I don't see a way out," start saying, "God will make a way." Instead of dwelling on what's wrong, start declaring what's right about God's power, His love, and His faithfulness. Your words shape your reality. Your focus determines your experience. The moment you start magnifying God instead of magnifying your problems, you step into a new level of strength, faith, and victory.